I'm Carla Macklin with Clever Charlotte Sewing Patterns, here today to talk to you all about bias binding. Now, you may be familiar with bias binding when you use it to finish the raw edges of a quilt, but I'm here today to show you how you can use it in apparel patterns to make such items as this adorable little peekaboo top or dress for a little girl that has exposed binding along the shoulders. So let's get started. What you need to begin with is an apparel pattern that you first have to take out all the seam allowances from. So if your pattern has 5/8 seams or 1/2 inch of seams, anywhere you want to place the bias binding, you want to make sure that you cut that off of the paper pattern before going to the fabric and making that cut. So once you have the fabric cut out from your pattern, you need to decide how you're going to deal with your bias trim. Now, at your local craft store, you can always find something called double fold bias binding. It looks like this. It comes in a roll. It's all ready to go. It comes in lots of different colors. It's folded like that on the inside so that all the raw edges are together. And while this is super easy to use and convenient, I like to make my own. So I'm going to show you that today, how you can choose your own fabrics to do the bind such as I've done here. So what you start with is a piece of cotton. Quilter's cotton works real well. A lightweight to midweight cotton or even a silk would work fine for this application. And I find the selvage edge along the length of the fabric. And I've done here, I've marked a length. It doesn't matter how long you make this first line, as long as it's parallel to your selvage edge. And then whatever length here you use to finish off a perfect square on your fabric. And don't worry about marking up your fabric. It works just fine if you take a permanent marker to this step. So once I've got my square drawn on my Quilter's cotton, I'll find the true bias grain to the fabric, which is 45 degrees off of the selvage edge. So now that I have a square here, I can easily line up the cutting edge and take a rotary cutter and hold it down. And this should come apart in two places. I might need to snip it a little bit here. And now that I have that cut placed into the fabric, I can use that to cut the rest of my bias strips. So in this application, I'm cutting a 2-inch wide bias strip. So I'll use this ruler to measure out 2 inches from that raw edge that I just cut. And I've got the first of many bias cuts in this strip. So I already have some cut here that I can show you. So once you've got them all cut out, you can choose any size, any length. I like to try to minimize the joins in the fabric, but often you'll have a long length of bias binding that you'll need to put together, like such as for the hem, and you'll need to join these strips together. So to do that, you might be inclined to lie them right sides together and just stitch right across. But let me tell you, from experience, this doesn't work. So a better way to handle this is take your first bias strip and place the second at a 90-degree angle to your first. And I'll put a pin here to show you where it will be sewn. And the trick with making this, it's not very difficult, but what you need to do is sew from the notch where the two fabrics come together to the other notch, right along the line that I pinned. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and stitch this down. Now you can see that the needle is going to go right in that notch, and I'm going to align it so I can just sew a very straight seam all the way across to that other notch. If you're off, you may need to rip it out and start it again, because it does look funny from the front if you don't match from notch to notch. So you see here that I have that red thread contrasting so you can see it from notch to notch. So now I take it back to my pressing board, and first I want to trim off the excess in either direction so that that notch is no longer a notch. And then I want to trim the seam allowance back to about a quarter of an inch. Seems to work well. And then I want to press that open. And you'll see as I press it open, it's nice and linear, and the stretch of the bias remains in place. And it will nicely go around the edge of an unfinished edge of a garment. So once I've got a strip together, I'm going to start pressing it to allow it to fold on itself, put those double folds in. So what I do is I start with the wrong side facing me, and I have a couple different options on how to do this. I could fold these edges in to make the double fold bias binding by doing it by hand and just pressing it along. But I like to use my grandmother's bias turner that looks like this. There are other types of bias turners on the market that you can find at your local craft store. But this one works really well to produce a 1/2 inch bias binding tape. And what I do is I slide the first corner through, and as I'm pulling it, you see that it begins to turn the fabric. And then I can just use my fingers to guide that first fold that I'm going to press. Now, one thing to take note of, there is about a 1/16 of an inch between where the raw edges of the bias tape meet together in the center line of that tape. And you want to leave a little bit of a gap, because otherwise the bias binding can get a little bunchy and not lay so flat. So I would do the whole length, and once I've removed the bias binder, I want to take the other edge of it and match the folded edge up to the folded edge. So you've got the 1/2 inch of binding all ready to go. So that's what it looks like when you've got it pressed, and that is very similar to what's in the package. So I've got one finished here. I'm going to take my pattern piece in this gentle curve that I want to apply the bias binding to, and I'm going to start by leaving a little bit extra floating on the edge. I always like to have a little bit extra that I can trim off later if need be. And I'm going to set one pin just to hold it there while I take it to the sewing machine. And this gentle curve is great for 1/2 inch bias binding, but any steeper of a curve, any tighter of a curve, you might need to reduce the width of your bias tape. You want to put the needle in a position so that it's right next to the first fold, about a 1/16 of an inch over from that first fold. The raw edges of the bias binding and the garment pattern piece are together aligned, but you want that needle to not be on the fold itself, right next to it, about a 1/16 of an inch, and then it allows the bias binding to turn around to the wrong side of the fabric. So I'm going to start sewing with the needle down, making sure that it's right where I need it to be. And then as I'm sewing this, I want to tug along the bias binding ever so slightly to put a little bit of tension on it. This also helps it wrap around the curve and look nice and neat when it goes to the pressing board. So now that I have that done, I want to take it and press. I can cut off this extra bias binding. And you'll see from the right side that it looks nice and neat from the front. But now I'm going to wrap it around. And actually, before I do, I'm going to trim off about a 1/16 of an inch again on this raw edge, just so that when I wrap it, it doesn't get hung up with any of the raw edge along this seam. It just makes it look a lot nicer, and you end up not fiddling with it quite as much. So once you've got that done, you can press this by wrapping the bias binding around to the backhand side. Now, I'm going to do a technique called stitch in the ditch. You can finish this by hand if you wish, but I think it's a little faster by machine. And what I'm going to do is place pins all along this edge so to capture the underside of the bias tape. And my goal will be to sew right along the edge of the fabric between where the garment meets the bias binding. Okay, so I'm going to come over here and spread apart, to the best I can, the bias away from the garment itself so that I can catch the back part of the bias binding. And this is a little tricky. You want to go slow to make sure that you've captured it along the back so it's secure not only from the front, but that back part is also sewn through. And again, I'm using this contrasting thread so you can see it a little bit better, but when you use a matching thread, then it should just disappear right into that seam and capture all the layers together. So take your time. I'm not taking my time right now. And then I'll take it back over to the pressing board and give it one final press. And you can see clearly the red, but if this was a dark gray, it would hide right under there, and it's caught on the reverse side of the fabric so that it looks nice and finished on the inside as well. And so to finish this project, I have applied the bias binding along these curved edges of the shoulder seams so that when the pattern pieces are overlapped and stitched together, they allow that little peekaboo. And I've finalized the dress by putting additional bias trim around the neckline and tied it into a bow. It's also in the center front. And certainly you could style this in any way. You could add the bias trim to the hem, around the cuffs, maybe make a little belt out of it. So there are plenty of applications, and I encourage you to try bias binding for all your apparel needs.